Hello everyone and welcome to Handmade Hero Show, where we code a complete game live on stream. I wanted to mention something at the start of the stream, and we can actually probably use this for some stuff I wanted to do on the stream. Yesterday we kind of made the mistake of thinking that the crash message from RenderDoc was because RenderDoc was crashing, which I didn't really understand. But it turns out they just display the error messages weird. If your app crashes, it says that RenderDoc crashed, which I don't understand why that is exactly. Nsight does the same thing. And so we thought they weren't working properly, but then we actually figured out further in the show that that was what was happening. We just set the path wrong. So there's a couple things I want to do. First of all, I want to avoid that problem in the future, and we've never really done any hardening on Handmade Hero, so I wanted today just do brief, like not really much hardening, but just a little bit, where like if you run the program and it's not set up properly, it would produce some error message so that we know. Just again, in case we're using a utility like this on stream, I want us to be able to see that it's not working properly and not just crash, right? And we might as well do that anyway, because you don't want that to be the user experience. So when we go to ship, we would need something like this anyway, so it's not wasted. And the second thing I want to do is then today we can run RenderDoc a little bit, learn how to use it, and use it to do a few more cleanup things on the graphics pipeline that I'd wanted to do as we roll into the lighting doing pixel shader lighting. So I feel like we can kind of do all of this today and do some nice stuff with it. So hopefully that'll be good. And also I was really, really impressed with the tech support on RenderDoc. Maybe it's because they know who we are or something, but I don't know if it's the normal result. But like, that when we submitted the thing, they literally sent back something within minutes. It was in my email. I noticed it after I ended the stream yesterday, where they were just like, oh, this just happens if there was a null pointer dereference. It could be because of RenderDoc, or it could be because of you. If you need me to track it down or help track it down, let me know. Like, I never get tech support like that from hardly anything except the like the stuff that was handmade. Like Remedy or 4Coder, right? Like, so it was a really, really good experience, and I was very impressed by the level of. I mean, I didn't pay anything for that software, right? I would buy something like RenderDoc, and they just give it for free, and then we're supporting it. So I don't know how that works, if they're supported by somebody or just really like doing it out of the goodness of their heart. But either way. I thought that was really impressive, and that made me want to use it, right? Because I kind of felt like if I did the work of reporting bugs and stuff like that, that somebody might actually fix them, which is pretty different from the experience I get with, say, Microsoft Windows, where, I can report bugs all day long and even have conference calls with the people who make it, and they don't even understand what I'm talking about most of the time. Parentheses, I'm looking at you, Visual Studio. Thank God we don't have to use that program anymore. All right. So let's go ahead and get started here on that process. So here's our Nsight. We got that working just fine. RenderDoc we've got here. And again, it's just another, you watched me install it yesterday. If you didn't see that show, you can go back and watch. But I mean, all we did was download it from the internet. It's pretty easy. You download it from the internet, you install it. There wasn't really much else to do. So if you go into RenderDoc, you'll get the icon here. I'm going to go ahead and pin it to the taskbar like I've done for some of these. That way, we just have along here all the stuff that we tend to launch at all. So I'm going to go ahead and click on this and get RenderDoc up here. And then I'm going to launch our process. And we're going to do a few things with that. So if we open, oops, I don't want to open a capture. It's launch application. That's what it is. So I'm going to do load last settings. This is what they are. And as you can see here now, if with the directory path set properly, it runs just fine. So what I want to do is go ahead and fix the problem that we had, which is that if you give it the wrong directory, I don't know, that, for example, or who knows where, you get garbage. So in fact, I don't know if we, in the data directory here, oops, yeah. So if we actually try to launch from here, you can see that that's when the crash happens. And yeah, the thing, and I actually mentioned this to them in tech support, and I think they were like, oh yeah, we should. I was just like, this makes it sound like RenderDoc thinks it crashed, It doesn't sound like an indeterminate crash. If it said like If it just said something like, if your app has done anything wrong, you'll get the same dialog box. So, we don't know where you crashed. If you're pretty sure you didn't crash, then go ahead. Then I would have probably gone like, oh, I should go look or make sure we're not doing anything wrong there, right? So I think that probably needs to get fixed, but other than that. So, I would like to make it so that our app doesn't crash when you give it the wrong directory. Just a little bit of hardening so that the initial setup state, if it happens to be busted, it doesn't do anything particularly bad. And so what I'd like to do is just spend a couple seconds getting that working. It's not super hard. We just need to add some way of reporting stuff when we can't load our fonts. Like normally we would render stuff to the screen ourselves, but like if we don't even have the ability to load any fonts, then we certainly can't do that. And there's other kinds of critical failures, like if we couldn't open an OpenGL context or something like that. So given the fact that no, don't open you. I should just delete that program off the hard drive. It's such a horrible pile. All right. So if I actually load up Handmade Hero and run it normally, what I want to do now is be able to set in the session here, if we actually get this and put this to a very bad location that won't have any of our files in it, I just want to start fixing this. And so what you can see here is we get this kind of crash that's because we can't load the font that we normally use to display stuff. That's the one thing that we always need to have, right? And so what I'd like to do is just have some way of making, of sort of notifying or, yeah, just having some errors. I'll remove this, I'll fix this crash, and then we'll try to fix the errors and we'll go from there. So let's first take a look at, I'm going to go into debug mode and see what the easiest way is to make sure we don't crash on no font load. And then we also kind of need to pop up an error message telling people what is wrong. And since we don't have fonts in this case, we're going to have to use like a system message box of some kind, right? Okay. So here you go with get font info, and you see it calling this font ID here, and you see the assertion firing. When we went through here, what we would want to do is probably, let's see. So when we get the font info, if this came back as 0, then that would really be all we would need to know, I think. And so let's see. How do I want to do this? I'm going to first see if we go into get font info. So if we go into get font info here and we assert that this type equals HSA asset font, I'm wondering if maybe what we want to do is I guess what we probably want to do here is assert that it's either that or nothing. So in other words, if you can't load the font, you'll get back a 0 handle. I just want the assertion in there to prevent you trying to load something and it ending up being some other type, right? Now in release mode, these wouldn't be in there. So we wouldn't get that assertion, right? But I'm curious what happens now. Okay. So I'm not sure what this does exactly. So that looks kind of garbagey to me, so I'm curious to know where that came from. Let's just take a look at what's going on here. And again, I'm just like pushing through the code slowly to see like what happens if you can't load anything, to get rid of any paths that sort of like don't handle zeros well. So here's us calling simulate. Here's us updating and rendering our entities. Here's us doing our push cube. And so this bitmap ID here is what would be busted, presumably. Here's what's saying get bitmap on this ID. And you can see the ID is 0. That texture handle on get bitmap 0, I'm not sure what that's doing. I want to see what that's doing. So it looks like asset texture handle is, so this get asset, if that's 0, I want to say we're not probably handling that properly. So in all of these cases, I feel like we kind of want to do something a little smarter than that. We probably want to do something like this. You know what I mean? Just to make sure that basically people will crash out immediately if they're not handling the 0 case. We could also give them back a garbage version. So like another thing that we could do, for example, is have some sort of global 0 handle. Like for example, something like this, you know, something like this. And in that case, we could just say, look, either we're going to give you back the right one, or we'll give you back the null one, right? And so in this case, we don't really need to do anything like that. We can instead do just look, did we get the asset? If we got the asset, then use this. Otherwise, don't, right? But maybe what I'll do instead is something more like this. If asset, then do this branch, just so it's a little clearer. And then we'll have in here a path that will, oops, a path that will just set oops, a path that will just leave it set to 0 so that it knows what's up. For sound samples, we'd need to do the same thing, but in this case, it looks like we sort of were doing the same thing. And in this case, we could just say, look, if the asset exists and we get it, then we're good. Unfortunately, like all of these sorts of things need to be inside the checking. So basically, like here, we need to push these down to where we've already checked asset for validity. I guess that argues against doing it this way as well. So basically, we do, look, here's the null bitmap. We'll look inside the asset only if we know that it's okay. So something like that. And that looks pretty good to me. So now these are a little more hardened. They're not going to have that crashing problem. I just want to push that through to the rest of these. So same thing here, like when we're doing these lookups, I just want to check to make sure that the asset actually exists before we do anything. This HHA asset here will get set only in the case where it actually can. Otherwise, it'll return 0 to you. Or, again, I could do this, right? I don't know. Maybe those should be in the game assets itself. I'm not sure about that, how I want that to look. That's kind of a different question. Maybe it should. So if we go to game assets here, like for example, down in here, like maybe we just put the null stuff in there. So there's like, all right, there's an HHA bitmap that's the null bitmap. And every time we return one of these, right, we would just return whichever one of these is the right one. So we take one of the HHA assets here and we say, look, if we got it, great, we'll return it. Otherwise, if we can't, then we can't. I think that's really all we're looking for. So in this case, we say this is going to be assets null asset. Otherwise, we actually look at it. Oh, and that's the actual HHA, I suppose. So it's actually this. Oh no, it's actually already the HHA one. So maybe we say null HHA asset, just to be clear that it's not a null. It's not the null for the other kind of asset. And then up here where we did that for null bitmap, I just want, and maybe I'll put null HHA bitmap as well. I'll just put that in here as well. And then I think that's a little bit nicer. When we've got, let's see, null HHA, when we've got fonts, we probably want the same thing. So there's like a loaded font here called null font or something like that. And maybe we just put that in there. I don't know if that will work properly or not. So I don't know if it's better to return 0 or to return the null font. So maybe we'll... I don't know what we want to do there. But either way, we want to check... Oops. We want to look at the asset. And we want to return the loaded font. I'm going to give it back a null font for now. And so this will give back a null font, and then what we'll do is, if we get the asset, we'll actually properly provide the font. It looks like you're supposed to provide a 0 anyway in this case, so I guess that suggests to me that a 0 is always okay. So I'm just going to make that happen, right? So we'll just do it this way. Let's say. And then finally, for font info, looks like basically the same thing. So if we can't get the font out, then we'll give it this null, right? So in this case, it would be if the asset exists, we assert it, and we get the actual data out. Otherwise, we don't, and the result is that null. So again, just patching those pointers into like a block of zeros so that anyone who wanted to use one without knowing whether it was valid or not will just get 0 values and go, okay, I guess this font doesn't have any characters in it, so I won't display anything. That kind of thing. Oops. That is... Wait. That is correct, isn't it? What's the problem? Empty control. Oh, thank you. All right. So that's about it. Let me go ahead and run that and just see what we get. Perfect. So we now run properly when we don't have any HHAs, and we can't see any fonts, but that's still pretty solid, right? And so now at least we wouldn't have any crashing, but we still haven't really notified anyone that something seems wrong. And so what I would like to do is maybe just have some way of notifying people, sort of a thunk through in the platform layer. We've got sort of these limited set of platform services in the platform API. These are what we expect the platform to provide. And so if we look at these, what I'm thinking is, maybe here there's also like a platform fatal error kind of call. You know what I mean? And so when we call down to that platform fatal error, we can run the game, and if something happens that just makes it like completely impossible to continue, we can call that and issue that fatal error message. So the way that would look is like inside the assets, let's say we load up and we look at the assets here, and we just see that, there's none of the things that we expect to be there are there. So for example, if we look at the asset count and there's like no assets, or if we look at the file count and there's no files, right? And we can just display something like, hey, man, not good, right? So let's add something like that. If we go into the asset loading, where we're actually loading the files, let's just take a look. And if we find that there's no files loaded at the end of it, so in here, we go through and we do like this kind of thing. Not sure where we set that file count. Here it is. So when we look at this file group and we look at this file count here, if this ends up being, nothing, would be one example. Or if we never load any assets might be another one. And we can just issue a warning. So maybe what we'll do is just look at the asset count. We know we set the asset count here, right? We set it to 0. We ink it to 1 after the 0 asset, and then we go through and load as many assets as we can. So maybe here I'll just say, look, if assets asset count equals 1, we'll just say here we can sort of say, look, we need you to do something about this because we probably, or I should say exit out maybe. So, because we at least need an HHA that's like the basic things like the basic font and stuff like that. And so if you run the game, and I guess we could probably do it this way, now that I think about it. Because if you run the game, if you're building in Handmade internal, we do need to give you a chance to import some assets, because maybe you were starting fresh. But then we should probably issue a fatal error. If you can literally not load any assets, we should probably issue a fatal error, I would assume. Right? And I guess I could call this, maybe there should be multiple ones. Maybe. Maybe I'll do it more like this, where we can do like an error message, and maybe we can say whether it's an error message or a warning message or something like that. So it's more like this. So something like this where I can say which kind of error we're talking about. And so maybe in the error message I say like, this is non-fatal because technically we still run, but it's probably bad. Something like this. And that just implies kind of how this would be set up. So we would have a platform error message call here, and oops. Something like this. And it probably just takes a platform error type for the type of message, and then a string, right, for the message. So the platform error message basically says, you know, display this to the user using some kind of built-in platform thing that hopefully won't fail. It looks like this. And I think that's all we really need. So then I just need to implement one of those at the platform layer. And let me see, undeclared identifier, that's true. This has to go first. There we go. Let's see. Okay. So now if we run the game here, we should get a crash of some kind. Oh. Looks like Remedy was unhappy there. I don't know why Remedy was unhappy there. We could probably grab a mini dump. Let's find out. So that's a jump to 0. Actually, George, if George is watching, looks like jump to 0 is a crash. Possibly. Let's see if we can repro this for George, because otherwise I don't know if you can't debug something you can't reproduce. Let's just double check and make sure I'm right about that. If I just make something right here, I can see, yeah. So if I just literally in this directory right here, just make a file that's like in void main and I say type def void function void, like so, function star function equals 0, function, I'm just going to save that into the temp directory, wtemp function, or jump to 0 crash.cpp. And I think, if I'm right, then that was probably all it was. So, oops. Right. So there's that crash, which is what we'd expect. Now let's try it under remedy. Oh, I forgot to update the remedy to... Well, actually, I thought that... Well, never mind. I did... I think this is the right version, right? 282. Nope, I'm wrong. Okay. I guess we gotta send a mini dump then? I thought it would just be jump to 0 might crash it, but it didn't. So this is a weird bug. Let's see what happened. Because it was supposed to jump to 0, and then I was gonna like, we didn't set the pointer, so let's go set the pointer. That's what I was trying to have happen. Weird, and it worked here. Oh man, I should have saved a mini dump. Now we have no idea. Alright, sorry George. We missed it. I don't know. I don't know, man. But hopefully if we catch it again, I should just take a mini dump. Anyway, moving on. What I was trying to say before that happened was just that this is a 0 pointer, so when it calls this error message, it should just immediately crash, which we saw it there now correctly crash. And so what we need to do is patch that in the Windows side, right? We've got to make it so that we call a valid function that will actually display this error message. So let's go ahead and do that. Now, in the Win32 layer, we've got sort of this bunch of stuff where that's actually happening. I'm going to go and put platform error message in there, Win32 error message. And all I'm going to do here is just have Windows output an error message, and then we're going to exit process. So exit process, and maybe with a -1, just so people know that it died, right? And so all we're going to do here is just immediately say, here is a message box saying that everything died, and then we're going to go, oops. And then we're going to go and exit. So if I don't print anything, right? Oops, I won't do that. If I don't print anything, then all it will do is just exit. And so it will still, you know, it would still close our app, but that's not very helpful, right? Oops. We didn't actually set the pointer. Let me search for allocate memory. So in here where we set up the table of API pointers, error message is Win32 error message, right? And then we're pretty much good to go. So now we just close cleanly, but that's really not what we wanted to do. The whole point here was to inform the user that something had gone wrong. And so I'm going to go ahead and try to do that. So looks like I put this in the wrong place because that's where all of them, I shouldn't have put it up by the process stuff, but I did. Yeah. All right, sorry about that. Let me move that. So let's take error message and move it down to where all the rest of the Win32 calls are, because that was actually what I wanted it to kind of be. I should probably put these callbacks in like their own file or something so you can see the entry points a little bit better. Yeah, so there's like file close and all that stuff and allocate memory. So anyway, in here where we do Win32 error message and we have exit process 1, what we want to do now is say, well, first of all, we want to check to see what the type of error was. So if I am fatal, I want to exit, but if I'm not fatal, I should probably not, right? So if it's a platform error fatal, we'll exit process. If it's not, we won't. So then we just need something to put up a dialog box to the user, and you know, message box EX is probably the easiest thing to do. Hard to say. But here's message box EX. You can see what it contains. It's basically a pretty simple call. You pass it an ASCII string, and you pass it an ASCII string to display as the message, and a thing for the window title. You say what kind it is, and then you say what your H window was that you wanted it to pop up on top of. You have an optional language ID. In our case, it's just 0 because we're not actually going to be customizing that message or anything. Then you can pass one of these flags, and you can see which one you want. OK in the case of a non-fatal error is probably what we want, and abort in the case of a fatal error is probably what we want. So we just probably switch that based on the type. So if we take a look at what that is, it's a uint value, so mbox type. We're going to set that to whichever one we want. By default, we're just going to use ID OK, but we're probably going to want to do this. So we're going to look and see, we're going to set the mbox type to abort if it's a fatal error, and then we're going to exit. In here, we're going to call the message box EX call. That's this right here. So we'll do message box EX. And we need to pass the hwind, which we don't necessarily have one. So we'll need a way to see whether we have one or not. We'll take care of that in a second. And then we need like the text information. So we've got the message. And then we have a caption. And so the caption, I guess we'll set dynamically here. And so what I'll do here is we'll pretend that the caption is Handmade Hero Warning. And then if it's fatal, we'll do Handmade Hero Fatal Error. And we'll just stick that at the top of the window. Then we've got the message box type. We've already determined that. And the language ID is just going to be 0. So really all we need is to know about what the window handle is. Now, we typically just use one window handle in this game, so presumably we can just actually look it up. If we go to like the global Win32 state here, and we look at what that stores in it, I believe that'll just have the window handle if we actually have one. Let me see. So I thought it would. Looks like we're not posting that window handle out to here. So I would like to post that window handle out. So if we look back at... I guess if we look back here, we never post it. We just leave it in here. So when we go to window here, probably what I'll do is I'll just save this out, just so we have it, right? I don't know why that's weird. So when we get this window handle out, and I want to have it go into the global Win32 state, that global Win32 state is something that we initialize right here, right? And so I'm just going to set it to the window handle when we get the window handle back. That, and we'll just call this the default window handle, so you know, probably not above the ticket mutex, maybe something like that. So this default window handle will give us what we want. If it's 0, it's 0. If it's valid, it's valid, and either one is okay to pass here. And then I think we're pretty good to go. Let's just clean up our compile errors. And that should be that. Yeah. So if I run this, now in theory, you can see here we get the warning message. I don't know why there's a cancel box, because I didn't want one. So I think I've set that wrong, because there aren't two different things you can do there. So that's a little bit busted. So let's take a look at what the actual settings here are. I was setting them wrong, sorry. I was looking at the wrong flags. These are the return values. So this tells you what got pushed. I actually want these here. So MB OK is actually what we wanted for the type normally. And I think that's it. So we would start with just that, it looks like. And if it's a fatal error, you know, we've got, it's these icons that are probably what we want. So we probably want MB icon warning. Or icon stop, right? And so this way, depending on which one we are, it should show a different glyph there, basically just built into Windows. So there's the warning one. And let's just double check. I'm going to try doing a fatal error now on that same condition, just to make sure, again, that the, you know, that the function will work if we did have a situation in the future where we wanted a fatal error. I want to make sure I, you know, double check that that actually puts up something indicative of a fatal error and then closes the app. So if we pass a fatal error here, so you can see now we got the full error message. If I hit OK, it closes. So I think that's pretty much all I need, right? So now that we have this too, I want to say that there was so you can see here, there's at least one place we had errors happening. In fact, in here, I think we probably have some too, like logging, right? So in these cases, we probably want to put forth the fatal error as well, right? So that's if we couldn't register the window handle. That's, yeah, you can look at these. So if we didn't get samples, yeah, and if we didn't register the window class. So if we didn't register the window class, again, that's a fatal error. So we can just put those in here, right? So basically in all of these places that we weren't printing out error messages before, now we can. So in this case, these should never happen. Like it would be, you would be in some kind of really severe Windows is broken kind of way if you can't open a window, but so let's see here. The samples pointer is just an unable to allocate memory for sound samples. So something like that. And then, you know, I don't know if there was any, I guess we have logging, so I could just look for logging. That's just missed frame rate. So I don't know what else we've got yet. There's probably some other things in here we could go through and clean up and put them in there, but for the most part, I think we're good. So that's all I wanted to do. Just really simple, you know what I mean? And that should cover us in most cases. We'll see if there's anything else that we really need later, but that's what we want to see. And so hopefully now, if we just go ahead and reset this. I'm not sure what happened there. Why are we not loading anything anymore? That was weird. What's going on with that? Looks like all the data is still there. Unless we rewrote it. Soft Bean, come on up. The puss is with us. Sure seems like we got plenty of data there. So what's did I mess something up when I was? I thought I did this properly. There's Handmade, W Handmade. That's all we really need, right? How come I'm not getting any? How come I'm not getting any graphics? What happened? Still get our lovely sphere and our light probes though, which I feel like is good. What you doing, Bean? Do you want to help debug us? Do you want to help debug this? Huh? Do you? I'm going to go ahead and look at what happened asset loading wise. Oh, I wonder if some of those guards are wrong. So actually that makes some sense. Meaning if I, in here, if when you do the bitmap, if I guarded one of the bitmap calls wrong, that would probably do it as well. So if, all right, we got a saucy Bean. Bean, what's wrong? What's wrong? What are you looking for? You know we can't program if you're in front of the keyboard. You know that, right? What do you want to do? You just want to look out the window? That's not going to get the code done. That's not going to get the code done. You know that. And you refuse to help. You never type anything good. You always type garbage in. I don't know what you type in code in cat language, which doesn't work on our computers. You probably have more advanced computers on the planet that you're from. There you go. All right. So what I'd like to do is just go ahead and look at those calls I modified there, like get bitmap, and make sure that I may have like accidentally garbaged those up. So actually in here you can see this was not supposed to be this way anyway. Probably want that. Let's see. So make sure all the results. Okay, so we did this wrong. The result isn't here anymore for some reason. I accidentally deleted it, but that's why, right? It's supposed to have like a get texture call. How did I delete that accidentally? I don't know. So this is the problem right here, right? You can see that render, the result here is not getting set to anything. I think that's what we needed, right? Just looking at whether or not any of these also did the same thing. So it looks pretty good now. Let's take a look. There we go. So I think that's all that we really had to worry about. So now, looks like we're back in business. So what I'd like to do now is, again, try it with RenderDoc and make sure that we've fixed the actual problem. And then take a look at a couple things that I wanted to look at, just a separate sort of issue. So if we open up RenderDoc here, and we're still got it set up wrong, I'm hoping now that like when I launch, we won't crash RenderDoc, we just pop up a warning message, and so that's just more pleasant, right? Okay, this time it's them, I want to say. So maybe it wasn't really our fault. Maybe it's only half our fault. So, I don't know. Now, granted, we don't really need it to handle that properly because, you know, we know what's wrong. We saw the message box. So I guess we're okay. Yeah, I don't know. But point being, we can run it, and so everything's fine now. We can look at the performance and stuff like that. And if we take a look at the performance of the application, again, there's some weirdness, and I don't really know what it is, so I would like to take a look at it. If we turn off requesting vsync, so we're not actually asking for vsync anymore, then what you can sort of see is we don't quite always get a solid frame time, right? We sometimes are missing 60. We're like sort of stuttering between 60 and 30, right? And you can kind of see that happening here, right? And so I would like to know a little bit more about why that's happening, and I don't really know. So we looked at the memory issue, and you know there could be still some of that happening, but I kind of doubt it. So I think it might have to do with the fact that we're sending these vertices down too many times for no reason. I was just kind of hypothesizing that that might be true, and so I was kind of hoping to get a look at that. So if I ask RenderDoc to capture for us, and we go back and look at the capture, so here's the capture. At this point, I just want to kind of know, like, all right, what do you think is going on here? And I'm not sure, right? But here's my theory. I'm just giving you a theory. There's a lot of guesswork involved in performance profiling, certainly. So these duration information things, I don't know that they're particularly accurate. Like, I don't know that this helps you with anything because this seems to be a nonsense number. There's no way that our game takes 35,000 microseconds. I don't think that's plausible. I mean, it's maybe the worst case time is that, but like if you look, that would have to be the worst case time, I guess is what I would say. Because if the game ever ran at 60, then you know that, 1,000 divided by 60 is 16, right? So that is what we would expect to see somewhere like between 16 and 22 or something like that, right? The lowest we saw on there was like 42 frames a second or something, so 23. So this number just seems fictitious and not representative of the performance we're actually seeing. So I don't really trust it. But what we could say is maybe the magnitudes are relative, so maybe it does correctly say that this is the place where the time is being spent or something. I don't know. But anyway, what's nice about this is we can see our passes, right? We can see them happening. So there's the first pass, there's the second pass, there's the third pass, there's the fourth pass, right? So basically we're rendering the slices that we then composite back together. And what I'm hoping is the primary source of our slowdown, but I don't actually know. But what I'm hoping is the primary source of our slowdown is that we don't right now really do any work to make sure that when we send vertices down to the graphics card, that we do that in an economical way. And there's two stages of that we could do. One is we could actually be really careful about only sending down vertices that have changed from frame to frame. That's like the most hardcore, and that involves actually tracking changes to the system and stuff. I don't really want to do that. Not yet anyway. The second thing is just making sure that they don't get submitted every time, because we have 4 passes here. And in the naive approach, the OpenGL driver may be sending down those vertices all 4 times, even though they don't change, right? We know they're the exact same vertices for 4 render passes. We want it to know that they're the same, and it doesn't have to resend them over the bus or copy them into driver memory or anything like that, other than the very first time. And so that's the main thing I'd like to do, is actually go make sure that that's not happening. And so my assumption is that it is happening, and I would like to take a look and see if we can actually eliminate that. So looking at the timings here, if we were to believe them, which I don't, but let's just say they were accurate or at least relative, we would expect these draw calls to take time and these calls to not take any time except perhaps the first one. So maybe this call takes some time, but these calls should be free, right? Because they're actually the same data. You know what I'm saying? So I'd like to get that worked out and see what happens there to see if that improves things at all. And like I said, I don't really know if it will, but I just want to play with that a little bit. So again, running this guy, if we launch it, no, I don't need you to save that capture. If we launch it, I might want to turn vsync off so I don't have to keep doing this, right? So we may set request vsync to false. That's in the render test. Yeah, so we're just setting this here. So what I think I'll do is, what I might do is say, look, if handmade internal, so it's us, we don't want to set it. So by default, we'll ask for vsync, nice locked 60 frames. But when we're doing our own internal testing, we turn it off so that we can see what our frame rate actually would be, so that we can make sure that we're optimizing for that, right? So let's go ahead and launch. There we go, right? And so that's a nice, that is a nice 60 frames a second. And then you can see sometimes we get into situations where we're starting to climb, right? It seems to be mostly when we're moving, which makes no sense to me. I have no idea why that would affect anything, actually. It also doesn't seem to be locked at 60, even when it says it is, so that may be an average frames per second. So anyway, let's see what we can do about that. I just want to see what we can do to get that a little bit cleaner. So let's start with some basic stuff, and then we'll get more unbasic as we go. So inside the OpenGL driver here, just to take a look at what's going on, you can see when we enter a render entry textured quads here, you can see that we bind some textures, and then we do the draw elements base vertex here, right, to set what we're going to use for those. And then when we're done, we actually, in fact, we actually go through and say, is this the slow dispatch path or the fast dispatch path, right? And you can see us using them here. And it depends which style of use we're using, right? You can see that for passing the indices or not. And then when we actually bind the vertex buffer, you can see that happening up here. When we do bind vertex buffer, I guess it probably just has to load them out, and it doesn't really have any idea. Yeah, so I think it may have to kind of just grab those every time, right? And we really don't want it to do that. So what I would like to do is kind of take a step towards a more optimal render dispatch path and say, what if we just sent these down as one like clean pass? So we said, here's all the vertices and indices, OpenGL for this frame. And then when we refer to them, we want you to be able to know that they're not going to be changing out from under you. So you don't need to resend them every time, right? And so in order to do that, we need some way of telling OpenGL like what's going on with that. And there are ways we can do this. If you look at, say, docs.opengl, which is a good, like we've always used this for looking up our OpenGL documentation since people pointed it out on stream, it's been really useful. And if we look in here, you can see that there's ways of actually giving OpenGL information about buffers that are specifically there to tell it that these are not touched, or more specifically, we can tell them when they are touched, right? And so GL map and unmap buffer is one way of doing this. GL buffer data is another one. And we can decide kind of which ones we want to do. But let me kind of give you the layout of how they work. And unfortunately, these things change over time. So which one's the right one to do in OpenGL kind of changes. It's one of the bad parts about OpenGL. The advice before used to be one thing, and then it was another thing, and it's just a long story. But point being, what this allows you to do is, if you think about what's going on in the code here, right, and we look at this, what happens is I'm effectively saying, all right, look, I want to bind these buffers. Here's the vertex buffer, here's the index buffer, right? At some point, I told you what the data was using buffer data. You can see it here, right? So we sent it down, and we said that this was something that we were going to draw. And then later we said, all right, let's go ahead and draw it using GL draw elements base vertex, right? And in theory anyway, well, actually, now that I think about it, if we're already using GL buffer data. I was about to say we should use it, but we're already using GL buffer data. That should have sent the data down and kept it there. So this should only send the data one time. Just looking at this. So I guess, yeah, again, you know what? We already did the thing, much like yesterday, we already did the thing, although yesterday we didn't ever really actually use it, but we already did the thing that I was expecting. So I'm not actually sure, yeah, again, where the slowness is coming from there. Let's run the GL profile in Nsight one more time. I would like to know if maybe someone can tell us what the graphics card is actually having trouble with here. So I'm loading up Nsight here. I'm going to go ahead and hop around. And so, yeah, again, I guess maybe, I don't know if it's just Windows compositing that's the problem. Maybe when I'm full screen, it gets... No, you can see, like, it's spiking up, right? We're missing 60 right there. Very consistently. So if I ask what's wrong, I'm curious what it tells me. How do I get... I can't seem to get Nsight to want to come to the front. How do I get Nsight to come to the front? Dear Nsight. This is not helpful. There we go. So I guess I just had to Alt F4 that window. I don't know what that was supposed to be. Anyway, so if we look at the profile on here, just trying to figure out what the actual slowdown is there, it's kind of, again, a little bit hard to tell because, if I look at what these are, draw element space vertex, that's this call right here, supposedly. I look here, here's another draw element space vertex, right? Here's a draw arrays of size 4. It thinks that was taking a ton of time. And that's the multi-sample resolve right there, right? So it thinks it was taking 1.27 milliseconds to do that multi-sample resolve, which maybe it is. I don't know. But I'm not sure why that would be the case. It's kind of tricky to say. But I believe, right, I mean, just looking at where that probably is in our render stream, I believe it's this call here, resolve multisample, where we're basically saying, like, look, draw this one triangle strip here, and we're using the resolve multisample program. So, you know, maybe the resolve multisample program really sucks, and that could be, right? Like, maybe this program is really bad and it takes too long. That seems totally plausible, right? And I guess I don't know. But you can kind of see the code here. It might be because, hey, it has to fetch all of these texture samples. That could definitely be, because remember, it's a multisample, and we're trying to resolve the multisample down. And just trying to look at what's going on in here. I guess I'll agree. Looking at it, it looks too long. So this is the actual path right here. We set the depth min and max. We look at what the different depths are in the depth sampler, like this. We take half the difference between them, because I remember we heuristically determined that was the best way to resolve multiple samples. I'll be honest, I don't understand why we really did that. I'm not sure why we didn't just use the one that had the highest alpha. So I'm not entirely sure why we did it exactly that way, but anyway, we looped over the sample count, and we sort of combined these together, right? I guess what I would say is, the first thing I'd say is looping versus a constant. So this loop can't be unrolled. We probably want to unroll it. And so what we would rather do here is have sample count be a constant, so this loop can be unrolled by the shader compiler. Just because we probably do want that to happen. And you can see us doing our color combinations here. We do the color combinations with our own multiply, which I don't know how intelligent that is. And then again, this env sample here has to be a real inversion because it doesn't know what this value is. So a lot of that stuff just doesn't make a lot of sense. So we could probably fix some of this stuff. I don't know to what extent we can really fix it, but without going a little bit further down the rabbit hole. But presumably we can do a little bit better than this. So I don't know where the alpha comes in. I'm not sure why we're not outputting any alpha, but I guess that's because we don't actually use it in any subsequent passes. We just use the depth, I guess. Just looking at it here, and I'm just not seeing any alpha pass through, right? I mean, you see us setting surface effect. Maybe surface effect.a got set up here. Yeah. So it does preserve the alpha. I take it back. So it's kind of confusing, and I guess I'm not really 100% certain. But what probably has to happen here is that we probably just want to start by making this be a constant. And so let's go ahead and do that. So it's pretty easy for us to do. Instead of sample count getting passed down, what we can do is in the fragment code here, we can just pound define the sample count. like this. Okay. And so here we're just going to say the sample count is a constant value, and so you can use that constant value everywhere and optimize this code when you compile it. And so in here, what we do is we would just want to insert that in there. You can see us doing basically that thing here, right? So I'll say something like this. And then we'll just do a format string. And instead of doing this as a string constant, we'll just like printf this basically, and pass the sample count here, right? So we just need to know what that that multi-sample count actually is at the moment. And so when we're passing that, when we actually go to use that multi-sample program, we were obviously passing down the actual value somewhere. Let's take a look at where that actually happened. So you can see here, right, we were getting that result sample count out. So what I'd like to do is just remove that. So wherever that sample count, actually, yeah, right here, I'd like that to go away. And then I want to see what we were passing down there, who was actually setting that and to what. So you can see it's setting the sample count to just the max sample count. So that should be pretty simple to emulate, right? So we're just setting that. Oops. Like so. All right. I don't actually want Handmade Hero to be running over there. How do I terminate the program? There we go. So I'm going to terminate Handmade Hero, so we get rid of it there. And then I want to debug this, different, this sampler with the hard-coded constant in there. And I may want to look at it a little bit more as well, just beyond what we're looking at here. And I want to make sure that it actually works, right? But it sure looks like it works, right? Yeah. So I think that's working just fine now. And if I actually look at the compile multisample now, so in theory, it should just be unrolling those loops, hopefully, but it's still got to do like 16 fetches there, right? And stuff like this. So I don't know what the most efficient way to actually do that would be. I will say that like we're only using combined color now, so obviously like emit and MPL are going away. I'm not super sure what else to really do here. I assume this value is smart enough to not be recomputed, but just in case it wasn't, what we could do is actually pass down in sample count as well. So basically that would just be a percent %f there. Oh, Molly Bean, that's an unhappy kitty. So we could do something like this as well. Just to produce whatever that value is as a constant. So that way we know that these are coming through as constants and not as any other kind of value. So that we know it's not actually doing any work there. Because I don't know how smart the shader compiler is. I think it's pretty smart, so I would have suspected it to have done that transform automatically, but I just want to make sure that it is. So since we know the env sample count, we also can probably just let me see here. Taking the square root's not great. So combining in sRGB, taking the average in sRGB space versus taking the average in versus taking the average in linear space. This is a place where I think we probably would want to start leaning on the graphics card. So having an actual direct sRGB transform and using real sRGB would probably be significantly better here, because this texel fetch could automatically do the sRGB for us, and it would probably be free. Whereas here it's costing us 16 multiplies, which is, it's a lot of multiplies. And I think that would be nice to get rid of, right? So, yeah. So, I don't know what I want to do about that. Similarly, we'd get rid of the square root, but that only happens once, so that's a less concerning value, right? I don't see much else in here that we're really doing. What I would say is, why are we looping over these twice, though? And in fact, what are we even doing with this? This depth is not used. So I feel like we can at least consolidate this a little bit. The shader compiler obviously already probably knows this, so I'm not sure it really matters. But what I'm thinking is, if we just moved V4 combined color up here, and then in here where we're doing this nonsense, we can just literally grab just the one part we wanted, which is this, and do it inside here, right? Because this doesn't actually depend. These are not dependent. They just are separately computed. So I think we can just do it in one loop like that and be done with it. So I'm going to give that a shot. And again, I don't know... I don't really know, looking at this, how much that sRGB, if we had sRGB in there, I don't know how much that would help us, but I'm not sure. So looking at the profile here, doesn't look any different. Again, really just have no idea what's causing that. Let me look at full screen, see if there's any difference. Yeah, we just have no idea. Like we are completely blind as to what the total frame time action is there. So here's the frame display time, and you can see, right? You can see that difference there, and I have no idea who's doing that, right? We have no idea why that's happening. We're not really changing what we're doing much. And I guess debug collation is an issue. So, maybe we should be turning that off to a certain extent, because, if we look at the timings here, debug collation is taking up a pretty big chunk of it. What's going on inside game update? Game update and render is taking all the time. We don't have much more. Update and render entities, sim region, loading test. So, looking at this too, just in terms of the amount of time it takes us to get the frame out to the card, we could optimate. That's good. Optimate. We could optimize that guy quite a bit. Looks like we've got too many vertices going through that path of the pipe. Inside update and render entities, we know what's taking all the time there. So when we output that grass stuff, right? Let's just take a look. Here, so when we're drawing the ground cover, right? Like if you were to turn ground cover off, you would take a load off of the vertex pipe quite a bit, and I'm just curious to know what that looks like, frame rate wise. So the ground cover has been turned off, and if we take a look at the frame timings, right, we get a definitely different view here. So there's the waiting on the frame display, there's the debug collation, there's the game update time, total game update time. And, if we hop along through here, we can kind of see what we're getting for frame time. And it looks pretty consistent there. So I guess what I would say is, I don't know, we're getting some very odd behavior, and behavior that I don't like, which is that, and it could have to do with the fact that we're doing the multi-monitor streaming stuff, but you can see as I hop around here, we're getting clearly not 60 frames a second. There's like jerkiness, but it's unclear where that's coming from or why. Right? Like our frame timing is not reporting something different. You know what I mean? We're seeing the same profile, but when you actually look at the world, you get a completely different perspective on it, right? So I don't know if you guys can see this, but like it's jerky. It doesn't look 60 frames a second to me. And again, I don't know. That could just be because of the problems with outputting to a second monitor for streaming, and that is happening at 30 frames a second or 60 frames a second, mandatorily, right? It can't do anything else. So it may be like as if VSync is on, even though we have turned it off on this machine. And it's really hard for me to say because I don't know what's going on there with the streaming, right? I don't know if if the Windows compositor is affecting us there, right? But what I can say is at least from our profiling, we know that we're spending a bunch of time, in that way, right? And debug collation here obviously taking a lot of that time too. Which again is unfortunate. That's just looking at all of our debug event information. So, if I turn that off, we could also see to what extent, when we're running in an actual environment here, what we would get. And I don't know. So if we look at Handmade debug, or Handmade slow, I'm curious what stuff actually I feel like we probably want to have a way of still recording just the basic information about the frame time and just not recording the rest of this. You know what I mean? So, if I go into here and we set Handmade slow to 0, if I go look at the profile, we're still going to be spending a crap ton of time in debug collation, right? And so Handmade slow doesn't really mean what it means. You know what I mean? What it says. Because, here's the process list out, and almost all the time is being spent in debug collation all of a sudden, right? And so what would be nice to do is to get rid of most of the debug collation stuff. And so, all of the block data output and the timing and all of that, maybe that kind of needs to go away, right? So looking at how we've got this here, I'm just trying to think if we can selectively enable some of it and disable some others. So here's a bunch of stuff that happens. Looks like all of this stuff is probably fine. Timed block, probably not. So like these. You can see we've got like a separate set of these coming on afterwards. So, getting rid of this is probably pretty easy. This just needs to get cleaned up, So, you know, you could imagine doing something like this and trying to make this work. So that would take out some of it. So now, for example, well, no, that didn't work. I would have expected this to go away. Right? So we said if define C++ and Handmade internal, and you're not... oh, that's because it should be and the Handmade slow is set. Okay. Debug set event recording macro redefinition. Yeah, so these and HUD timed function were up here. They were in the separate block. So they were up here. And so that makes perfect sense why those were in the wrong place. Let's see what else fails. Frame slider, undeclared identifier. So debug UI element looks like it's not going away for reasons that I'm not sure why. So debug UI element is defined where? So debug UI element is just calling record debug event, but debug UI element should be nerfed, right? So it's just missing, that's all. It needs to go away. Looks like debug hit and debug highlighted also. I can't say why those are the same. So really these just need to be if not defined, right? So if you didn't define these functions, we then will define them. Otherwise, we don't do them. And then I think we can eliminate the stuff that you know is providing editable values, but that's about it. And then we have to just make something that where timed blocks, you know, would get turned off as well. So if we look in here, right, now when we open, we should get nothing. I don't know why that's an error. We'll have to look at that. But you can see, like, these are turned off, right? Unfortunately, that doesn't, yeah, and you can see that doesn't really help. And also, like I said, I think it's mostly the timed blocks and stuff that are the problem there. So if we were to say, all right, let's not care about that so much. Let's care about this. So we basically say, like, all right, these things, time block, time function, begin block, frame marker, set event recording, HUD timed function, right? Maybe these are actually the things that we go with slow on, so we'd say something like this, and I don't actually know. So in here, we would oops, wrong side. So basically what I'm saying is, look, if handmade slow is not turned on, then don't time anything, right? And then debug collation should not take any time because we're not actually doing any debug collation. But of course, yeah, again, like you can see the jerkiness really didn't help. And that was because even with debug collation on, we were still well within 60 FPS. So I'm pretty sure this is just Windows Compositor sucking, would be my guess. But again, I'm not 100% sure one way or the other. So looking through here, right, and as I hop around, of course, I can't actually look at any information because we don't actually have the timing. So what I'd like to do is just move it out just a little bit so I can look at the timed, I can look at the overall timed blocks, maybe just the most important ones, and then maybe know nothing else, right? So if we look at like frame marker, for example, maybe frame marker has to be there. So frame marker is always set, and the code for frame marker is, yeah. So like if I just put frame marker, so we can time like frames, for example, and then I take the frame marker and I put that out here. So, you know, we turn off all of our timed functions, but we leave on the ability to just see the frame time itself. So then we can at least see our milliseconds. We just don't have much visibility into anything else. And we could have a top level, like we could have one more thing that just shows us that breakdown. But, you know, so here's sad Casey, and we're looking at the frame time, and it says it's 10 milliseconds. So I don't know. I'm expecting a nice, smooth 60 frames a second. I'm definitely not getting it. Thank you to Windows. It's clear that I'm getting it sometimes, right? But I don't think I'm getting it always. And it could be something else we're doing wrong. I don't really know. So with that said, let's pop back to Nsight. Let it do a little profile for us, right? And see what it has to say. And so you can see it too thinks we're lock 60, right? Like it thinks we're getting 60, no problem. Which again makes me think that it's like Windows Compositor just being completely unable to do the stream at the same time. I should probably just bite the bullet and get some kind of I don't know if there is a device that has a zero latency HDMI pass-through and that also then splits. But I should just buy one if there is. Anyone out there know? Does anyone know if there's a thing that takes HDMI output, splits it into two, but doesn't introduce any latency to the frame so that on the main monitor you're still seeing it real time? I don't know. I mean, I was just going to introduce a little bit of latency, but I mean, like, you know, no real latency, not countable in milliseconds latency. You know what I mean? Because I'd like to get to the point where we could run this thing reliably, maybe turn off Windows' nonsense so that we're not trying to stream out two ports at the same time. You know what I'm saying? And so basically a lag-free splitter, does it exist? If so, tell me. Also, Insobot just said something awesome for those of you who are watching in the chat. All right. So, right. Let's terminate here. I'm going to do one capture and just see if anything's different about it. I don't know why I can't terminate my program without crashing it, but that's just where it's at. I'm going to go ahead and do this launch game profiler. I'm going to get a profile in some place that's drawing a lot. So like, you know, out here, let's say. It still claims we've got 60. I don't know why it's claiming that when we're not, but again, it's probably some Windows thing that's awesome. We'll go back here, take a look at the breakdown. And so if we look at the breakdown, you can now see that, you know, the draw calls versus the dispatch. So again, if you believe what we're seeing here, this would imply, and again, I don't really know why, but this would imply that the GL draw arrays call, where we just do the multi-sample resolve, that is by far the most expensive thing. And so the question is, how do we speed that up? I wish I was a graphics expert because I'd probably have some opinions on how to speed that up. But, you know, see if we can learn anything from these numbers. So fragment shader invocations 2 million. That's the number of times that it did the fragment shader. I want to say that if we speed crunch that, you can see exactly where that number comes from, right? So for every pixel on the screen, exactly, it's invoking our fragment shader, which is exactly what we would expect. For each invocation, I don't know what these numbers mean, but looking at them, like, this looks like it's waiting on texture fetches, perhaps. I'm not sure. Math pipe throttle presumably would mean that we were waiting on the math pipe. I don't actually know if that's accurate, but I don't care about that. More draw calls than dispatches doesn't really make a lot of sense to me. I'm not sure what that means. More draw calls than dispatches. Hit rate on the L2 cache is almost perfect. So it'd be hard to argue with that. The hit rate on the textures is not so good. But I'm not sure what you would really expect. I mean, it's got to pull all that information in, so I'm not sure how it could possibly remain in the cache. We don't care about the user metrics at the moment, I don't think. Looking at the... So I don't really know that there's that much I can really gather from this. But, you know, if the only thing I can really say is it looks like just the fact that that shader is too complicated is what takes most of our frame time. And so, I don't know, we could... So let's say we wanted to determine whether that's fictional or not. So let's say I went in here and I just said, hey, you know what? The max multisample count is now going to be 1 or something, right? So we just straight up lied to it. And here, instead of this, where I'm actually outputting real values, I'm just going to say 1 and 1, right? So now we're... Oh, and I got to terminate this guy. Terminate. I know you can't seem to figure out how to terminate sometimes, but just terminate, trust me. So if I was to force it to just take 1 texture sample each time instead of 16 texture samples each time, then what happens? So, I mean, it looks like it's not lying. I mean, look at how much faster that got, right? Again, didn't improve the actual visual frame rate very much because it seems like that is just jerky because of other Windows issues. But if I go to the same place now and I go back here and take a capture, yes, I know. And I don't want that. if we take a look at what's going on here, you can see that now the resolve and the drawing take about similar times, right? And so looking at that draw call again, I don't know what. Okay. That doesn't seem good. Hello? Yeah, who knows. So anyway, point being, looking at these two, you can see that now the resolve took significantly less time according to the profile here. And it's more commensurate with the time it took to draw the screen. That, strangely enough, that actually seems kind of accurate. So here's why, here's my made-up explanation of why that seems kind of accurate. So if the multi-sample count is 1, what you have to remember about multi-sampling is that multi-sampling doesn't kick in unless you actually need to draw multiple samples at the pixel, right? And so at the actual pixel, if you only ever had to take one sample, if you only ever had to fill all the samples together, because those samples were taken from entirely within one polygon, there wasn't an edge going through it, then you only ever had to update one piece of data, not 16, when you were drawing. And that's going to be most of the time for us, because most of the time we're not on an edge. That's the whole point of multi-sampling. The reason it's better than super sampling is because you only pay for it on actual edges. When we do the resolve, we're reading all 16. So drawing the screen only had to touch one sample per pixel on average, right? But resolving the screen has to touch 16 pixels on average. Pixels. I mean, they're samples, not pixels, right? So here's my question. Inside the fragment shader, is there any way we can ask OpenGL how many samples you actually took? Like, if all the samples were one value, we can get a fast path in there and maybe hit it most of the time and be okay. And presumably also, if I actually looked now, when we're only taking just one sample, shouldn't we see some of the badness? Yeah. So if you look in here, you can see like all these edges are super crispy now, right? And that's all we really needed to fix with the multi-sampling, right? Because our depth peel takes care of the depth sorting, so that all works, right? You can see I go right through the tree; it works perfectly on either side, right? Which reminds me, we should fix our occupancy stuff. But either way, so when we look at this here, what we can see is really our only problem is these crispy lines, and that's what the multi-sampling's for. So the question is, if we looked at GLSL, is there any way to get that piece of information? And let's take a look. This may be the wrong place to look. So this doesn't look like it defines the fragment shader stuff, though. Yeah, not really. So I'm not really sure if we can get that information or not. And that's something that would probably take a little while to research, but let me just explain what I want. And then we can probably take a look next weekend and see if we can get it. So the only thing I was trying to say there was, well, look, you know, in here, so you can see this path has to sum up a bunch of stuff, right? It's got to loop 16 times and do a bunch of work. But when we actually look at these samples, when we look at like Texel fetch, maybe I'll look at that as well. Like, so, you know, Texel fetch documentation. Do we have that anywhere? So I'm just curious, like, can we also just ask for that location that you're going to sample? Can you tell me how many samples were taken, or were they all the same? You know what I mean? Because that would allow us to skip most of the resolve that we're doing. And I just don't know if we can or can't do that, right? Yeah. So it says using GLSample ID or GLSample position could be used to work around this, but those are methods cause the entire fracture to be evaluated per sample rather than per fragment. Yeah, I don't know. It's like Dice took down this So the coverage mask being output, again, doesn't really help us. We're not looking to improve the output. We're just looking to optimize the resolve. I wish we had an NVIDIA person here or an AMD person here to just tell us if that's possible. Because that's all we really want, right? Is we just want an if. So, in other words, this could just be one thing, right? It would just be the following. Actually, we don't even need to do that. Just do this. So we would literally just do like, yeah, if we're in this path, which is like the slow path, right? Where I would just say, if we're in the slow path, you got to do all of this. If not, you just fetch it just once. Right? Like so. And similarly, like this stuff don't gotta happen neither, right? So this whole thing here only has to happen there, and this could just be like blend unit color equals whatever it equals, right? So basically, you can just fetch once. So we could just do an if, like, look, if there aren't any samples here, so if you only took one, then just write that one. You know what I mean? Otherwise, do this whole disastrous rigmarole, and off you go. And so then we should be able to set this normally. Debug this guy, and just have it so that we're always going to have a switch there that can switch between one sample or multiple samples. Looks like we got a error there, though. 1 second. Make sure to do it. If one... combined color equals 0, depth min max, 4 samples, fetch them, and add them, then set the frag depth, set the surface reflectance, set the blend unit color, otherwise set it this way. What did I... That should be exactly the same, right? Did I do something busted there? There's the multi-sample. That seems correct to me. I don't know. What am I missing there? I'm not seeing the bug. Maybe there is one. But I don't actually see it. Like, our resolve is not working after that change. Let me back it up and just make sure I didn't mess anything up, because that's a pretty easy change to make, so I'll make it again. Oops. All right, so that's one. Then we just want to move these up, right? So combined color goes here. All of this nonsense goes here, and we don't need to do the depth because we've already done it. Right? Good to go. And then I just wanted to say, okay, like this entire path here. So I'm going to move the frag depth down. So here's the output of that path, right? Looks good. And then I just want to put an if1 around it. So here's if1. If1, you do all of this. And if not, you do some other thing, right? And so right here, what we want is our frag depth is just the fetch of this. And our blend unit color is just the fetch of this. Of 0. Not sample index, obviously. And in theory, like that's just going to call this code, right? It's never going to call this code because it's an if1. So in theory, it should just work. Okay, what's going on? It has to call this code, right? Am I missing something? Actually, I don't know how many characters it is, but it's not 4,096 characters. It's hardly any. So something is up with that, putting this if1 in there. It doesn't really like it. So what happens if I just delete the else clause? Just curious. Still nothing. And then delete the if1 clause. So somehow putting an if1 in there changes the behavior of the program? How is that possible? Shouldn't if1 just always work? Like if you put an if1 around something, the only thing that changes is defined variables, but they're not getting used outside of there as far as I know. So I guess that's just an invalid program somehow that it's not that's not liking. All right. Here's NVIDIA one more time. Launch it up. And I don't see any error messages. Oh, well. Can we get these? Can we get more information about that? Let's take a look. What is the not a valid program? There it is. So it was giving us an error, but we didn't catch that error message for some reason. I thought we generally did catch those error messages and would output on them, but it looks like there's some kind of an error message getting generated on there. I would like to see the error message, but of course we can't. Let's take a look here. So I'm not sure why. Let's take a look and see why we're ourselves not getting it. Because that error message should be there, right? When we compile the program, in here, I thought we were asserting, like right here, shader. Oh, we turned off assertions because we're in Handmade slow. That was why. Okay. So now we can see what the problem is. Vertex errors, fragment errors, etc. Implicit cast from int to what? Oh man. All right. You gotta be kidding me. You gotta be kidding me, folks. Well, it is what it is. So we gotta do this, apparently. And switch that between true and false, because 1 and 0, oof, wouldn't want that. All right, so let's go ahead and actually, oops, I put that in the wrong place, and actually try to grab this information out here. So I'm gonna go back to a previous version. There we go. So now, excuse me. So now I should be able to do an if true, and that's where I'll leave it. So if true, now this should always run that path, and we should get our standard output, which we do with nice smooth edges, which is great. None of that crispiness. And then if we set it to false, we'd get the crispy edges. And presumably, if there was some way of testing whether the samples were or were not all together, then we could actually do something about it. So there's the crispy edge version. So I'm going to put if true here, and then I put like to do Casey ask some GPU people if this can be optimized with a call instead of true that says whether a particular location in a multi-sample texture has all one sample or actually contains multiple samples. Because I know the graphics card knows the answer to that question. So we'll see. All right, let's go to a brief Q&A now. Seems like we got everything we could have gotten squared away. And I think we're just gonna have to ask some GPU people, be like, hey, can we get this data? So Neil suggests texture samples, parentheses, sampler. But doesn't that just say the maximum number of samples? Or can you, because you need to be able to pass an actual UV coordinate, right? Let me take a look, but I'm pretty sure that texture samples just tells you how many it would have, right? Or is that not true? Maybe not. I don't know. We'll see. Yeah, see, that's just going to tell us the total number of samples per texture. So it'll just return 16. We want this call. But we want this call that takes a UV coordinate. So basically, we want the equivalent of this call that says, hey, graphics card, how many did you actually pack in there, right? Brian says you can have Windows automatically capture crash dumps for you. Check if this key exists. HQ local machine software, Microsoft Windows are reporting local dumps, and if so, will automatic capture dumps to local app data crash dumps. That's pretty cool. So let me do that. Thanks, Brian. Reg edit. So he says HQ local machine software Microsoft Windows Windows error reporting local dumps. What do I set it to? Maybe it's already set. And if so, then you said it would be local app data crash dumps. Oh. So we've had this the whole time, it turns out. All right, so now that's pretty great. So now I can go to crash dumps. I can grab all these, and then we can see what's going on. So that sounds good. I will send those all to George, and it looks like probably the ones from 5.11, 5.24, those are probably useless, but I'll send them anyway. That's pretty cool, Brian. Thank you for pointing that out. I did not know that I could do that. Oops. But that's great, because now I can send all these along. HandmadeHero.org watch has no more scheduled appearance. When will you be streaming next? It depends. That schedule gets updated every time I put in a new block of stream times. So it's usually every weekend, but you know, sometimes it gets modified. But it's usually every weekend. You should switch to Linux. Dude, Linux wouldn't even work. Trying to run something on Linux that goes through the GPU and outputs to two monitors at the same time, one of which is at a fixed frame rate and one of which is VSync, zero chance. Linux GPU support is absolutely terrible. It can't even run, you know, an Optimus display, let alone probably something like this. So no, definitely not. Like, Linux would not help at all. It would probably only hurt. It has very, very, very bad AV support by comparison. And don't get me started on audio. Don't see any other on-topic questions, actually. Rational coder. Someone had asked whether or not that would optimize anything since the GPU has to execute both branches. No, the GPU doesn't have to execute both branches. So it's worth remembering that GPUs do full ifs, at least most. So basically what happens is if you hit an if statement, then what it's going to do is look to see whether all of the pixels in that group all evaluate to the same thing on the if, and if so, it won't execute the side of the branch that nobody goes down, right? And so in this case, most pixels, almost all, would not have multiple samples. So most of the time, the block of 16 or 32 or however many the GPU is processing at once will probably all hit the same side of the branch. And only blocks containing an edge running through them would not. So I think we would get a significant speed increase from if we had that if. I don't know. I just don't know if that is ever exposed in the shader. Not sure if you were joking when you said to ask, but if you have the time and feel like it, I would 100% be down to see the lectures from you and about the rest of the animation system. Yeah, no, I will do those at some point, sure. I don't know if anyone what the status was on the I don't know if anyone cares about these is the only problem, but. So no one really cares about this stuff, unfortunately, as far as I can tell, right? It's pretty much just like a standard standard view count, right? And so I don't know like how useful it is for some of these things, because like if you look at what stuff is tends to be more viewed. Some of ours are actually that way. So, you know, if you look at like things like some of the other ones where I go over stuff, they do have a lot of views and things like that. But in general, like, you know, I think the 3D animation stuff probably doesn't because it's very advanced, and I just don't know that there's very many people who can really follow it probably or use it. But I don't know. So, you know, if the skin animation one had like tons of views on it, then I would say, okay, this is something people really wanted to see, right? But I don't think putting it under chat does make it less clickable. And flashy thumbnails, like none of them have flashy thumbnails. So I'm comparing apples to apples here. But if you take a look at the chats, it seems like the ones that are interesting, people actually get a lot of views. So like not many there, but like any of these other ones had actually quite a bit. So like this one had, you know, 4 times that many or 3 times that many, right? And so the chats do seem to be fairly popular most of the time, much more popular than that. This one, which was done the day prior, had twice as many, right? So I'm just trying to go by like, you know, chats are a sort of a separate thing we do. They're not really part of the series. And just looking at to what extent people actually get value out of them, I don't know how many people are actually getting value out of the 3D stuff. It seems like something that's just too far afield, maybe, you know? Because yeah, I think that might be just if you're at the point where you're implementing a 3D mesh skinning system, you probably know enough that you're not watching this show. or if you are watching the show, you just do it for like entertainment purposes, so you don't care about me covering it, right? Like you're not watching the show at that point because you're trying to learn something from it. You're just watching the show because you like having the show on or something, which is also totally fine. But definitely a different thing. So, all right, I'm going to wrap it up. Anyway, but the point being, it doesn't mean I wouldn't do it. It's just I don't feel a pressing need to get to it, right? So, that's all, really. My girlfriend watches and tells you most of the things you said about Linux are old school issues. Would you like me to stream trying to install several different Linux distributions on an Optimus laptop and watching how ridiculous it is? Because I do know the series of steps it takes to get them to work, because I've had to do it. But we could do that if you want. We could also demo how, like, I have Linux machines running, right? Like, I'm running a Linux machine right here as the streaming machine. And it breaks all the time, right? The mouse right now isn't working. I am moving the mouse and it doesn't work. Why? Because Linux, right? It's very unreliable for hardware support. If you think if you think Windows is bad for hardware support, well, Linux really ups that game. People who run Linux always insist this isn't true. I don't know why. I don't say these things because I don't like Linux. I like Linux and I use it fairly frequently, right? It just doesn't work half the time. And in general, the problem is if you happen to have a machine that works on Linux, great. Maybe you don't have these problems. I don't have any machines that work properly on Linux. They all took a tremendous amount of massaging to get them to actually run stably. And in general, Windows isn't that way. I get a lot more reliability on Windows in terms of the amount of time it takes me to install the system and get it working. Now, granted, pretty soon I'm going to have to run Linux everywhere because Windows 10 is rapidly trying to make it impossible for anyone to ever run a Windows machine reliably. So eventually Microsoft will succeed in making it so that even with all of the brokenness, Linux is still the more reliable operating system. And that day is coming. I wouldn't have thought it possible, but I think that at some point that day probably is coming, right? Because Windows 10 has been getting really bad and continues to get worse. The only way to really run a Windows 10 machine is to have it unplugged from the internet, which is how I run my Windows 10 machines, right? But that's only going to last for so long, and so I do feel like, in general, I think the people who believe that Linux is reliable on hardware, I really don't know what to tell you. I think you're kind of having a bit of a Stockholm Syndrome situation there. But that aside, I do see more Linux in my future only because Windows continues to increase the unreliability and the maintenance nightmare. They keep pushing it up. And so at some point, those lines are going to cross. And the amount of work it takes to get a stable Linux desktop or laptop running will cross, and it will now be more likely that you will spend, right now, maybe it takes 10 hours to get a stable Linux system installed, and it takes 2 hours to get a stable Windows machine installed or something. And that's going to keep... Linux is never going to get better. It's never gotten better in my whole life. Installing Slackware probably took similar amount of time because I had to rebuild the kernel every time, right? As it does to get one working today, because by the time I actually... And it never quite gets working, right? The mouse still doesn't work on this machine, but, what are you going to do? Eventually, Windows will also have the mouse not working often enough, right? It will also be several hours to install and won't really work right, and you'll have to do all kinds of weird registry hacking, right? And so eventually those lines will cross. And when those lines do cross, then there's no reason to use Windows really, other than to have a test machine because, you had to ship stuff on it. But eventually those lines will cross. Microsoft has made it very clear that those lines will cross. And Linux doesn't have to do anything, right? They can just sit there They don't have to improve their reliability. They don't have to do anything. And eventually Microsoft will just push those lines. You know? So off you go. Yeah, I sympathize with the person on chat who says, I have an Arch Linux machine, its dependencies are now broken and will take weeks to get working again. Yeah, the package managers don't work at all. They're super broken. For example, this machine has to have Node.js installed because it requires Node.js. When you use Firebase for distribution, you have to have Node.js because that's the only way it works. It's pretty amazing. You have to use Node.js to copy files now. And every so often, it's just broken. That's it. The package manager cannot actually update it, and you just have to wipe the whole thing and completely reinstall, right? That's Linux. That's the bottom line. And I really don't understand why people say it's better. You don't have to pretend that Linux isn't broken. It is broken. Windows is broken too. You don't have to fight about it, right? These OSs are garbage. Let's just accept that fact. Whether or not one is easier or harder for you personally depends on your hardware setup, depends what you're trying to do, right? And I think we can all agree that eventually Microsoft will destroy Windows. I mean, it's been getting worse for a decade now, and it's not gonna, I don't see any reversal in that trend. So even if, you are mad because I'm saying that Linux is still broken, look, I'm not saying that Windows isn't heading straight down the toilet. It is, right? And so in general, I would say, it's 6 to 1, half dozen of the other, but please be realistic about the quality of these operating systems. They're not good. Linux is not good. It may be better than Windows in some respects. It is worse than Windows in others. Both of them are terrible. They are lousy operating systems. They do not do what you want an operating system to do, which is run reliably without requiring updates on the hardware that you have. Neither of them can do it. They are both highly unstable. Small changes to either one can completely break them in ways that take quite some time to repair. And the chances that they will work out of the box in both cases is quite low. Windows is better than Linux, I think, in that respect, but still bad. Casey, please dispel the myth that Molly123 and I are the same person. Rupan3 has a crazy conspiracy going on I can't shake. I don't know. How do I know whether you're the same person or not, right? So, all right. For what reason do you like Linux if it breaks all the time? So two things. One, it doesn't force me to update, right? So unlike Windows, if I install a Linux machine, it updates when I say it updates, and I value that, right? So that's thing one. Thing two is that it is better set up for working with servers. Like, if you just want to SSH to your server, it's like already, you don't have to do anything, right? It's just set up. It just works. You can move files back and forth. You can shell to one. You can do whatever you want, right? Windows, good luck. Like, you've got to, use their, you've got to do all kinds of nonsense. And Windows 10 finally added like SSH support to a certain extent, but it's still not as good as on Linux. And so just working with that kind of stuff is just cleaner on Linux. And it's because that's where people use that kind of stuff, right? So it's just kind of nice, right? The terminal works better. The Windows terminal, they haven't updated in years. They just recently updated it, and like one of the main features they added was that it can be transparent now. So, on Linux, that stuff works better. So, I do feel like Linux does better. There are better aspects of using a Linux machine. And again, so I think anyone who thinks that like one operating system is like clearly better, they're not. They have strengths and weaknesses. And I wish that there was some good operating system that I could sit here and be part of the OS wars and say, no, you should use blah OS, but there isn't. All these operating systems suck. I don't really blame them sometimes because it's a hard problem. I mean, supporting such a wide and unreliable hardware base as is on the PC is a very difficult problem. But just because I can respect the fact that the problem is hard doesn't mean the results aren't awful, right? So like, yes, it's a hard problem for a number of reasons. There's a reason why tons of hardware doesn't work properly on Linux. I mean, right now, for example, I have one printer. There's one printer in this place. Linux lists 5. They're all the same printer, but you can only pick one of them and have it work. The rest just error out. That's Linux, right? I mean, that's Linux. You can't expect stuff like a printer to work on Linux. It's just completely unreliable. Why? I don't know. I've never looked at it. I couldn't tell you. But that doesn't happen on Windows. Windows lists one printer. And when you print, it prints to the printer. That's generally what people want to have happen with a printer, right? So again, like, don't sit here telling me that Linux actually works. It doesn't. It has tons and tons and tons of obviously broken stuff. And that doesn't mean that I don't think it's a valuable operating system. I run it. It's just, be honest. These operating systems are awful. Windows and Linux are not good operating systems. We don't have a good operating system right now. That just doesn't exist. So don't waste your time arguing with people or me about whether an operating system is good or better than another. It doesn't matter. These operating systems are garbage. And I don't see it improving. I don't see printers working on Linux tomorrow. I don't see Windows 10 stop rebooting half the time with updates I didn't ask for. Or Cortana taking 50% of my CPU time because some update broke how it runs. Like, that's just, forget it. It's not changing for quite some time. So, have a lousy day, right? You're going to have a lousy day because your OS sucks. That's the truth about computing right now. I wish I could have Amiga DOS back. I can't. What do you want from me, right? Anyway, on that note, let's wrap it up. Thank you, everyone, for joining me for Handmade here. It's been a pleasure coding with you, as always. If you would like to follow along at home, you can always pre-order the game on handmadehero.org, and it comes with a source code, so you can play around with it yourself. Maybe you can figure out how to get those monthly sample counts out of there. It may be impossible. It's wishful thinking. The graphics card does know. It uses it for optimization, so I'm pretty sure it has the information. Whether or not it's ever been exposed through the GLSL, I don't know. Or whether or not they just don't want to expose those kind of features because they need the flexibility to change how they work. That could be too. So I don't know. It would be nice. It would cause a lot less time to be spent in our resolve shaders, I think. I'll check with some GPU people if I can and find out what the deal is with that. But that's about it. I'll be back here next week probably. I'll update the schedule sometime between now and then to have the streaming schedule. But we will then put in maybe some pixel shading for sampling our lighting sources. We'll get that working. And then we can kind of tie the lighting around and kind of have a nice renderer. You know, it's not the world's most amazing renderer, but it's pretty darn good. And for a 2D game, it's pretty awesome, actually. The number of artifacts we have is pretty low, actually. I think we're looking really, really sweet in there. And our lighting, I think, will be pretty good, too. So I'm looking forward to that. Hope to be back here for that next week. Until then, have fun programming, everyone. Don't try to tell me that Linux is good, and don't try to tell me that Windows is good, and certainly don't try to tell me that Mac OS is good. Until next week, I'll see you guys then. Take it easy, everybody.